Today will be the final look of the GF80mm f1.7 for the Fujifilm system. And imagine that I'll be doing my Q&A session at the end of this video for the questions that you had asked yesterday when I posted a photo there, where I asked you, do you have any questions for the GFX system or the GF80mm? Now, the thing is, if you have questions, you can put it in the video today. But if not, and you want to see those answers, jump to the end. But if not, we will talk about the GF80mm, the final retail version, in this video here. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions. As I said earlier, this is the final review video for the production version of the GF80mm. Now, if you are not interested to see the GF80mm f1.7 review, jump to the back or in my bookmark here to really see the Q&A session that I'm going to do for this video here. And these questions are what you guys asked yesterday when I posted a photo in my YouTube channel. Now, the first part, which is the GF80mm retail version. First, this is my own personal copy. This is a box. Let me show you what's inside, which is really nothing much. If you have purchased any GF lens before, pretty much that's about it. So that's the end of the box opening of the GF80mm f1.7 by Fujifilm. So let's move on to the next thing. In terms of the physical quality, it is the same as the prototype. So take a look at the link up there. That will lead you to my initial review for the GF80mm f1.7. And it is the exact same lens. So if you are interested, take a look there and you know about the physical qualities about this lens. I'll just say that it is really not very big. It is very manageable on the GFX 100, more manageable than the GF110, and it is short, so the center of gravity is a bit more back, which is a lot easier to handle in the field itself. And that's about it for the physical part. I won't talk about it because, as I said, take a look at my initial video, which will cover the physical aspect of this lens. Next thing I want to talk about is the autofocus, or should I say the autofocus motor itself. Now, the autofocus system on this lens is the more stepper motor type or the more micro motor type. I'm not really sure what motor they use inside, but it is not the linear motor that you see in the GF50mm, the 3264 or the 110. So let me let you guys hear the sound of this lens. You can hear the lens moving and it takes quite some time. So what you hear just now is the on and off, where the lens move to rest and when the lens move and rack through the range. So this lens itself takes quite some time to move. As such, in the field itself, you can feel it that it isn't that quick. In terms of autofocus accuracy, however, it is really, really good. Let me show you a few of the photos here and I'll tell you that in most of the shoots, it will hit accurate focus more than 90% of the time. In fact, I rarely need to check for sharpness of the shot, but normally this lens will hit as long as you put the focus box onto the subject's eye. It will usually hit. So in terms of reliability of focus, it's there, but in terms of speed of focus, it's not quite there. Now, that is not the most problematic thing of this lens. Actually, the most problematic thing of this lens is what I'm going to show you now. On the GFX system, when you are pressing the play button like now, you have to park the lens within the system itself. As such, with this lens, which takes quite some time to rack through, notice the blackout period when you press play is really long. And this blackout period is the time taken for the lens to park. Now, the thing is, in the retail version, it's not that bad. In the prototype version, it felt longer. It was quite frustrating at times. But the retail version, I tried it for my 4 shoots. It's still there, just not as irritating if you ask me. For some reason, the lens parks a lot quicker. It tends not to wiggle too much at the end, but it's still there. And among all the GF lenses, this is probably the second or first most irritating one. Next to the 63mm f2.8, which has an extending tube itself, that lens also requires to park, and that's irritating. Now, this can be solved with firmware as long as Fujifilm just puts a firmware that disable the need for the lens to park when reviewing photos. Of course, when you off and on the lens, it parks, is fine. But when you press play, I don't think it should actually park the lens. So that will pretty much speed this whole operation quickly, because in the field itself, especially with a medium format, you're not going to burst tons and tons of shot. What you want is to shoot, check, so that every shot counts for you. At least that's the way I use it. So to me, this parking thing is sometimes quite irritating, because I tend to check a little bit more often. I just want to check sharpness, whether it's there. I'm not there to check composition. But the fact that this lens takes quite some time to park sometimes irritates me. And that's about it for autofocus. Now, the next thing we'll move on to is image quality. Before we start, let's take a look at some of the photos I shot with the retail version of the GF80mm lens. Now you have seen the photos I shot, so I did like 5 photo shoots. What you have seen, I think, is about 4 of them. Overall, I really love the image quality of this lens. It is, to me, the most appealing portrait lens for some time. I do enjoy using this setup more than almost any other setup that I have today, which includes the RF85mm f1.2 and of course the GF110 on the GFX100 system. This, to me, is my most enjoyable setup here. Now, the image quality of this lens. Let's start with the good ones. This lens is really sharp. It is sharp at f1.7, f2, f2.8. Really, really sharp. If you are looking for sharpness, this lens will not disappoint you. Now, in terms of bokeh itself, it is also very nice. Take a look at this shot here. The bokeh is smooth, it's relatively silky, and overall, if you ask me, really appealing. Partially it's because this is a shorter lens and it has a wider aperture. The bokeh tends to fall off a little bit smoother than the 110. The 110 had a little bit more of a sticker effect, which means that the subject is really nice and contrasty, while the background just blurs off. Now, some people love that kind of effect. Some people love the fall off effect, so it's a personal preference. But I quite like the fall off effect in the GF80mm itself. Personally, I like this kind of effect, maybe because I love shooting that kind of style, but it depends on your own personal taste. And if you are looking at longitudinal chromatic aberrations, it's there, it's not that bad. Take a look at this worst shot here. This is bright daylight, 14000 f2 on the GF80mm on the GFX100 using ISO 100. It is extremely bright. Look at the silver bar behind. Is there a lot of chromatic aberrations? Not that much. Quite okay. I mean, there are shots that are uploaded by DP Review that shows massive amount of longitudinal chromatic aberrations, especially in windows. But I believe those are like flare and more of a lateral chromatic aberrations, which can be quite obvious. In fact, let's move on to the worst part of this lens in terms of image quality, the lateral chromatic aberrations itself. Now, the lateral chromatic aberration is there. Let's take a look at some synthetic shots first. I shot with the tripod and the blinds behind, f1.7. You will see some amount of chromatic aberration with the tripod body, which is a black carbon fiber body, and then you can see the blinds are actually causing the lateral chromatic aberrations, purplish and greenish in nature. Now, if you stop down to f2.8, it tends to go away mostly, and that's for the purple chromatic aberrations themselves. I did notice in the field, the 1.7 has chromatic aberrations if you are shooting in the worst case scenario with the worst clothes, which is a white dress with black patterns like this shot here. Look at this shot. I show you one part of the dress and you will see the chromatic aberrations. Now, this chromatic aberration, however, is not hard to correct. Just use a dropper and drop it, it goes away. The thing is that chromatic aberration does exist in this lens itself, unlike other GF lenses, so that is something to note. So what happens if you stop it down to f2.8? Sad to say, there is still some chromatic aberrations. Take a look at the collar here. Of course, I'm not going to show you the full picture because I did not edit this photo. I only edit the color. But this is a collar portion and you can see green chromatic aberration. At f2.8, this is the chromatic aberrations that you will get. Now, this green chromatic aberration, I did notice that it is because the way I process. If I remove the processing away, it is there, but it's faint. It is not that obvious itself. So that is something to note, that the way you edit will result in certain chromatic aberrations being more obvious for the GF80mm lens itself. Now, going back to the processed version, right? If you use a dropper and just drop onto the green spot, you can remove most of the chromatic aberration. As such, if you ask me, the image is still very usable. And don't forget, this is the GFX100. What you are seeing is 100% zoom of a 100 megapixel camera. And as such, in real world, unless you are printing, even on a 24-inch or even a 30-inch screen, you may not see this line really obviously because the line is like 2 pixels wide. So it is not a super big deal, but to some, it may be a deal breaker. And that's about it for image quality. I have went through what I feel is the image quality of the GF80mm, production set itself. Now, let me show you one last picture, and that is a comparison between the GF80mm and the 110mm. Some people ask, is there a difference in the contrast or in like the bokeh? Notice that the bokeh, the GF80mm has smaller bokeh balls because it is not a longer lens. The 110 is a longer lens. However, the bokeh of the GF80mm felt slightly smoother, just really slightly. Now, is that a very big reason to buy the GF80mm? I probably think the 80mm itself, where you notice the field of view and the overall framing of a 63mm equivalent lens is a bigger deal than the bokeh. So if you are going to buy the GF80mm or the GF110, I believe that trying out yourself and see whether you can love the focal length of this lens is more important than the bokeh itself. So that is something to note. In summary, as I said, this is the final review. I'm not going to do any more review on the GF80mm until a few months later. This is, to me, my perfect portrait lens for the GFX100. In fact, this is the first equipment I test in a long time where I did more than 10 shoots to review the photos of this particular lens here. No other lenses did I go through so many shoots to review it because I truly enjoy using this lens in the field. In the field itself, this lens just felt perfect. When you post-process it, you will see chromatic aberrations, but in the field usage, it is very sharp, it is very accurate, it is generally well behaved as a lens. And when you go back and process it, other than keeping in mind that lateral chromatic aberrations will appear on extremely contrasty shots, there is not much flaw to this lens. It is very usable almost anywhere. You don't have limitations other than your imagination. And the bokeh is the type I like, which is slightly smoother and a slightly nicer and quicker, I should say, slightly smoother fall off. The 110 always gave me a slightly sticker effect, as I said just now, where the subject is sharp and then the bokeh just happens behind the subject itself. While this guy, you can see it sharp in the eyes and slowly fall off to the ears and away. And that's the feel I prefer personally. Everybody will have different opinions, and some people prefer the micro contrast, sharp look that just bokehs behind. But some people got different preference, and I think to me, this is my preference of a lens. As I said again, 10 overshoots done with this lens over 3 weeks is a testament on how much I like this setup over my RF85 with the R5 or my GF110 with my GFX100. When I test lenses, I rarely just use this lens exclusively for 3 weeks, because normally I get tired of the look, I get tired of the lens, and I usually tend to swap around because I have quite a lot of good lenses. But this is the first time I really continuously use this lens because I truly enjoy it. Now, in my really final concluding thoughts, should you buy this lens? I would say as maybe. This is not a perfect lens. It is a really nice portrait lens, but it is not a perfect lens. And if you ask me, this is the lens if you like the 80mm range. If you are going to buy this lens, don't look at it from the sharpness point of view or the low car point of view or the perfection optics point of view. Those are not important. The most important part of this lens is, can you live with a 63mm equivalent lens on your body itself. This is a 80mm, and once you actually convert it to full frame, this is about 63mm. Nowhere here, nowhere there. Some people don't like it, and for me, I love it. I really love this focal range. In fact, when I was using Leica system, I love the 75mm over the 90mm. I own both of the Summicrons, and I tell you that the 75mm is my preferred focal length. And it seems to repeat again that I prefer a slightly shorter lens compared to the 80-something equivalent. This is longer than the 50, as such you have less distortion. And personally, I really prefer this focal range a lot more than the 85mm itself. But as I say again, if you are intending to compare this lens to the 110mm, don't compare them based on the basis of optical perfection. Compare them on the basis of, do you like the focal length? After liking the focal length, then you compare the rest. I mean, if both focal lengths are okay with you, yes, then you should start comparing the lens. Do you want a slightly smoother bokeh? Do you want a slightly more optically perfect lens? Do you want a lens that has nicer fall off? Do you want a lens that has micro contrast? These are things that you will look at the stage where you get over the focal length itself. There is difference, and you should really think about it. Okay, that's about it for the GF80mm. Now let's take a look at the questions that you asked yesterday when I posted a photo and asked you guys in YouTube what kind of questions you have for the GFX system or the GF80mm. So let's take a look at some of the questions here. Okay, one of the questions is, I'm a concert landscape and architecture photographer and considering the GFX100. And then on general, he's asking, if I'm not wrong, for this camera's performance in low light and typical movement in a concert itself. Now, if you are talking about concert, it depends whether it's the concert high speed movement, or is it time, or is there time to shoot a person that is not going to just suddenly jump around, you know? So let's say if you are talking about orchestra type of concert, no problem. The GFX100 is perfect for it. I mean, nobody's going to just suddenly move around the stage, right? If you are looking for a band performing, probably also not a big deal, as long as the singer don't just move forward and backward like crazy. Now, if you are doing something like a rock concert, it depends whether the person is going to jump around non-stop, or is the person going to just stand in front and then scream in front of you. Those shots are quite okay, because when the person stands in front and scream, you can take a shot because they are static for a moment. But if the guy is going to move backward and forward, it's going to be very challenging for the GFX system, regardless of GFX100 or GFX50. Once again, not that it cannot be done, it's just challenging itself. And of course, the lens choice matters. Use those LM lenses, such as the 50mm f3.5 or the 110mm f2. Those lenses are a lot easier. Don't use the 100 and 200 f5.6 because that is really slow to autofocus because of its f5.6. The 32-64 is also slow because of its f4 aperture itself. So that's something to note. Don't use the 80mm here because it's quite slow, and the 63mm is also quite slow because of the type of autofocus motor in these lenses. Now let's take a look at the next one. Downloadable ProRes RAW. Sadly, I cannot produce any ProRes RAW because even though I do videos, I shoot with a C200 here. If I want RAW, I get the C200 RAW. I never once considered getting an Atomos Ninja to get the RAW from this camera. Maybe one day I will do it. Can lend me your lens? Nah, that would never happen. Of course. This lens is really nice, and I think I get the first few copies around the world. So I'm not going to release it to anybody really. Would the IQ be as good as the 110mm at f2 between the 80 and 110mm? I'll say as sharpness at f2 for the 80mm is very similar, but the chromatic aberration, as you can see just now, if you have heard the GF80mm review, this chromatic aberration is nowhere near the 110mm. The 110, even wide open, is perfect. The 80mm, even at f2.8, there is chromatic aberrations. But other than that, everything else is perfectly fine. And it depends whether you like the smoother bokeh or not, or you like the 80mm or not. But sharpness, the same at f2. Okay. How would you compare the GF80mm and the GF110 in terms of contrast? On general, the general contrast itself, they look really similar, as you can see in the comparison shot here. If anything, there is a slight difference of color in the output of the lens. And if you really want to compare micro contrast, I think the 110 will have slightly more micro contrast because it is sharper wide open, and when you stop it down to f2.8, it is razor sharp. Of course, the GF80mm is also razor sharp at f2.8, but the 110mm, because it's also a slightly longer lens, it probably gives you a more illusion of contrast if you ask me. But on general, overall contrast of both lenses seems to be really similar. Maybe the 110mm just a little bit more contrastier. What would be the most all-round value GFX lens for wedding and portraits? If you could only pick one, I was thinking of the Zoom 4500 and not sure is it good enough for portrait. But I am also taking into consideration f4 is more like f2.8 depth of field. And then I find it's a difficult choice. Let me see, with plenty of depth of field. Now, in terms of, for this question itself, which is by Elias, I believe it's pronounced Elias. The best all-round GFX lens is truly the 45-100, if you ask me. It's the most versatile lens. The only problem is that it's f4. If you are doing daylight wedding, no problem. But if you are doing indoor wedding, it is going to be painful. I tried before. No, don't use a GFX for indoor wedding unless your model is willing to stand there and pose for you. Or should I say, the wedding ceremony is generally slow. Asian weddings are really quick. They move really fast. The models, the couple is always constantly moving. They rarely pose for you for any reason other than to drink tea or to hand over the ring. That's about it. But if not, most of the time they are moving like really quickly, you know. And I'll tell you that the GFX system will struggle for those situations. So if you're asking me for a church wedding, I think the GFX system will be pretty much okay with the 4500. But if it's going to be a modern Chinese wedding, probably not. I don't recommend that. If it's a modern Chinese wedding, I don't even recommend using the GFX 100. I would say use the R5, the R6, the A92, whatever. Anything that can autofocus quick would be better for it. But in terms of lens, really, 45-100 is a really nice lens. But if you ask me from a portrait lens point of view, today I will recommend the 80mm over the 45-100 because I got a choice between f1.7, f2.8, and f4. And at f4, this lens is way sharper than the 4500. It really gives you super micro contrast, super contrast with this lens here that you cannot get with the 45-100. The 4500 is very versatile on the other hand. If you are doing a lot of studio portraiture, get the 4500 because in studio itself, you'll probably be shooting minimum f4 and probably f5.6 or even f8 or even f11 depending on what you want to achieve. So definitely, if you are doing studio portraiture, get the 45-100. But if you are doing outdoor portraiture or on general, most type of portraiture, I will recommend something like the 80mm or the 110mm if you like the focal range itself. Now, if you like 50mm, the 63mm is a perfectly fine lens other than its autofocus mechanism. That's about it, really. So, if I really have to only choose one, I will agree with you, 45-100. But if I ask myself my personal preference, I will never buy the 4500. I will buy the 80mm or the 63mm. The 110mm sometimes may be a bit too long. That's my personal opinion. And really, that's about it for the Q&A session. It's really short. Not many people ask questions. I mean, I will do more of such Q&A sessions in the future. So look out for them. You can, of course, also leave your questions in the comments below and I will reply you. Of course, I may also talk about it in the next video. But if not, really, just leave as much questions as you like. And I will try to answer based on my experience using the GFX system or the Canon R5 system. Or if you want to ask portrait level questions, portrait based questions on how I do my portraiture, how I like my stuff, do ask it below too. I will probably give you an answer. And if I can't answer with text below, I'll probably answer you in a follow-up video in the future. And that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. It is a slightly longer video because of the Q&A session, but I hope it really helps you guys when it comes to should you buy a GFX system or not? Is a GFX system good or not? This is the type of questions that a lot of people will be interested in. That's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.